Hello, my name is Jacque Tisdale, and I'm one of the founding members of the First United Methodist Church Prayer Quilt Ministry, where we do more than just sew. The September mission focus is on our Prayer Quilt Ministry. Prayer quilts are a way for our church to show support and offer prayer for our members going through a time of struggle. The quilt and its knots serve as a reminder that God's love is ever present and a whole community of believers is with them. Today I'm going to take you through the process of planning, crafting, and sewing a prayer quilt, which of course, remember, it's about the prayer, not the quilt. First, we need to pick a pattern. The pattern dictates the top of the quilt, where pieces are sewn together to make one whole piece. Once we've decided on our pattern, it's time to pick out the fabrics. We want to choose fabric that's pleasing. We like to choose contrasting fabrics. We want fabric that pops. We don't want a dreary quilt. We want a quilt that signifies hope and resurrection. Now we've chosen our pattern and fabric, it's time to sew the top together. Sewing the top is the most time-consuming part of making a prayer quilt. We need to put the pieces together to follow the pattern as closely as possible. Now that we've finished our top, it's almost time to put the layers together. Next up, we need to choose our back. We choose a piece of fabric that's large enough to cover the top and that's a color that complements the top's color scheme. The last piece of the prayer quilt is the batting. The batting is a soft, fluffy material that is sandwiched between the top and the back. The batting makes the prayer quilt extra soft and warm. Now it's time to place the ties. This thread actually holds the quilt together. Each thread is tied in a square knot by a member of the congregation. When the recipient receives their quilt, they can actually feel the knots and know that each knot represents a prayer that was said for that person and reminds them of the support they have in their church. When going through times of struggle, it's very important to remember you're not alone. Your church family is with you, and they're ready to show love, care, and support whenever they can. After all the ties are placed, it's time for finishing touches. The prayer quilt now gets its binding and hemming. A strip of fabric is sewn around the edges to wrap the quilt up nicely. Then the label gets sewn on. Each prayer quilt gets a label detailing that it came from our church and who it was made for. In almost 20 years, we've made more than 220 quilts. We try to take a picture of each quilt. We put it in this book with any pertaining thank you notes or notes of acknowledgement. In addition to prayer quilts, we also give each newborn baby in our congregation a baby quilt. Obviously, this is for a little girl, but we have boy quilts as well. And also, weekly, we pray for people with concerns in the church, and we often give them these cards. Inside, there's a saying, and we personalize them, like, we're sorry for your loss, or we missed you at church on Sunday, things like that. Our prayer quilt is practically finished. The only piece missing is the prayer, which is the most important piece, of course. We place the prayer quilt on the altar and ask everyone to stop by and say a prayer while tying a knot in the quilt. Ephesians 6:18, and pray in the spirit of all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. And this is what we hope a prayer quilt helps people to do, always praying, being specific in our prayers for the person whose quilt is on the altar. These quilts have been very meaningful to so many people, not only the people who receive them, but for the people who are praying. We thank this church and the congregation for all they do in support of our ministry. The very last step in our prayer quilt is the ties. They're left intentionally long to facilitate tying them, but they will be clipped before they're delivered. We have a few guidelines for each quilt. The first one is that you must ask a person if they're willing to have a quilt dedicated to them. Second is, a prayer quilt is never sold. It's not about the quilt, remember, it's about the prayer, and the significance of the prayer is much more valuable than the quilt. We hope that a prayer quilt is a lasting remember of the love of God and the love of our congregation. We thank you for your support of our prayer quilt ministry. We ask that you further support our ministry through tying of the ties and the prayer said for each person. So when you see a prayer quilt on the altar, please say a prayer for that person, whether you know them or not. It means a lot. Thank you again for supporting our ministry. And if you would like to request a prayer quilt for someone, there are cards in the back of the pews and in the front of the church. So just fill out a card and we will receive that request. But don't forget, it's about the prayer and not about the quilt.